So before I get cranking on the lecture today, I just want to remind you that I purposely wear my shirts inside out. It's not a fashion statement or anything. It's just the seams rub on. I have bursitis in my shoulders, so the outside of my shirts are smoother. So I wear baggy shirts inside out just because I'm old and I don't want to be uncomfortable. I know how to dress myself, dang it. Not really, sometimes you ask my wife. So let's talk about verbiage, concepts, and unique things that maybe we haven't thought about. So we are currently here, pelvic verb, right? So far, up until this point, we've done what we call appendicular motion, things we have appendages of. And we literally have like a left knee and a right knee. Right? Each of those joints have a side of a side. We call that lateral medial so that there's no confusion of left of a left, left of a right, so forth, so that, right? Now we're getting into the transition between left and right means literally your left knee to your right knee. And we're segueing into where left and right means a side of one thing. So your vehicle, there's the right side and the left side, but it's still a car or a truck. Okay? That's the right door and the left door. But if I had like one door, I might be able to say this is the right side of the door and the left side of the door versus literally a right door and a left door. What I'm saying is that rights and lefts, although we've been doing it our whole lives, can sometimes get confusing if you don't practice and apply this verbiage. Okay? So what we have is we have a right hip socket and a left hip socket, literally. Right hip and left hip. But those sockets are part of a fused set of three bones, the ilium and the ischium and the pubis. So you can't just move one bone about the other bone, right? Because they're welded. The body has a neat little welding system going on here. And your sacroiliac joint, which is a very small amount of give, that kind of in the middle, where it gives a little bit, but nothing of significant motion. There's a little play in here. But you can't make this, like the left scapula, move independently of this. So what I'm saying is that, or what I'm trying to emphasize is that this is one thing. The pelvic girdle is one thing. It's like a block or a ball. And we have a right side of it and a left side of it. Okay? What articulates with the pelvis on top, so the sacroiliac joint, sacrum and iliac crest. This is our sacrum, which are our 5 fused vertebra here. Fuse is great for stability. We don't want to have a lot of motion down there. We need stability to build up on top, like I used for the skyscraper analogy, okay? So these 5 fused vertebrae eventually start articulating with these unfused lumbar. Now each individual lumbar has a little bit of play, more than none, but less than most. The reason you only have a little bit of play per each individual articulation of all the vertebrae is because not only do you have to allow a little bit of motion and a little bit of give, just like trees sway to prevent being snapped in two, or buildings sway to be able to prevent crumbling down. There's sway that's involved specifically to dissipate some force. In addition, though, you have all of this plumbing that occurs down your spine, the way those vertebrae stack up, the foramen, they're individual little holes, but the sum total of a bunch of holes literally form a pipe that we can do wiring through. Electrical wiring for our nerves, plumbing for our vessels, veins, arteries. So it makes sense that we need to be able to bend or move a little bit, but we don't want to move too much where, we might interfere with some of that plumbing, some of those wires that are coming all the way down. So it's a really fine line between mobility and stability. How the spine works, I really like the skyscraper analogy, because if you have a tall skyscraper, let's use, let's say there were, let's see if you guys remember, how many lumbar vertebrae? Okay, five lumbar. How many thoracic? 12. And how many cervical? 7, good. Breakfast at 7, lunch at 12, dinner at 5 or something like that. But let's imagine we had a skyscraper that was that many stories tall, one for every vertebra. So 19, I'm from South Vermilion Parish, so 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24 stories tall. Wouldn't it make sense that, first of all, the foundation needs to be solid? You don't want to build that skyscraper on a crawfish form, right? You don't want that ground to be soggy. You want it to be on solid rock. That's what this is. Okay. The fused sacral vertebra that are kind of being suspended eventually by the legs. So solid foundation to build upon. Does it also make sense that your bottom floors are going to be denser than the top floor of your skyscraper? Because the bottom floor has to hold everything on top. And as you go up, each floor has to hold a little bit less stuff until you get to the top floor. All it's got to do is hold the seat. Make sense? In addition, it should make sense that the lower you go, the less motion you're going to have, because you have to be stable for all that stuff ahead of you. So as we work our way from bottom to top floor, you're going to notice there's a progression between dense, less movable, and we work our way up. And you can look at it as two ways. You can, when you transition between hot to cold water, you could say it got colder or it got less hot. It's two different forms of the same thing. So the vertebrae get less dense, more mobile as we work our way down, and they get more dense, less mobile as we go, more dense, less mobile as we work our way down the spine, more mobile, less dense as we work our way up the spine. I was doing relative to how I was going for me to be. So these vertebrae at the top of our cervical can be our most mobile, most movable. It's great. It doesn't have to support a lot of stuff on top. And getting our eyes across and sensing danger and stuff, pretty important. Our thoracic vertebrae still have motion, contrary to some clues. We're like, well, we have ribs that are there, so how can we move without the ribs? Well, I think it'd be one thing if these ribs were solid bone all the way around, but they're not. That's why you have all this cartilage right here. Cartilage is very pliable. Cartilage. Move the tip of your nose is cartilage. You can move that all around. You're not moving the bone, the cartilage. So the fact that there's cartilage here, those ribs can move about each other and shift and twist. So don't think that these thoracic are kind of anchored here because they're attached to bone. One of the coolest little facts that I learned from undergrad is that the difference, it's all part of the same skyscraper system, but the differentiation between the names is ribs. So you start with cervical, you work your way down, then you get to vertebrae that have a rib attached to it. That's when you start calling it thoracic. You keep going down until you get to vertebrae that don't have ribs attached to it, and you call that lumbar. Okay? So the way the spine works to help, because remember this class is about movements, okay? The way the spine helps to create significant motion is a summative effect. The sum total of several little bits can be a lot, can be significant. If any of you ever save change, every day, or you go through your pockets, or and a few cents here, pocket full of change there, any one day may not be significant, but over the course of time, you may be buying something nice, right? It's the sum total of all those little bits. Another analogy for the sum total of little bits, I don't know why I'm saying this, but I think it's a cool analogy. If I tap on your shoulder, it's annoying, but it doesn't hurt. But let me do this for an hour. Eventually, it may start to feel like there's a bruise there. I mean, eventually, you keep tapping over and over and over and over again, it's going to leave some damage. So then it's, well, it wasn't the first tap. Was it the 100th? Was it the 200th? Was it the sum total of all those little taps eventually created pain? Okay? So the way I like to look at the spine is like a slinky. There's a few ways I'm going to explain it. But when you take a slinky, you can bend the slinky, but it's not like an elbow joint where one bone had all of its motion because it moved about another bone. The slinky can go 180 degrees, but it was a little bit here, a little bit there, a little bit here, a little bit there, a little bit there, it was a gradual change of 180. Makes sense? Or like if you were stacking up, I used to do this when I was at my mom's, because we didn't have, like, she had like 3 channels and back in the day. So I would play with dominoes and cards. I would try to build card houses and I would stack dominoes and knock them over. And what you learn to do after a while, going straight's boring. So you start to try to, change directions and stuff. And you find out quick that in order to change direction, you can't take one domino and rotate it 90 degrees and go around it. Like you have to gradually change the direction. A little bit from that domino, then a little bit from that domino, then a little bit from that domino. And that gradual progression can change. Okay? When you're not at a stop sign, but you like at a curve, you notice you slow down and then you gradually change your direction. Okay? So that's what we're talking about when we're looking at spinal motion. It's the sum total of several floors that, when summating their little bits, can get significant movement in all 3 planes. The sum total. And isn't this kind of common sense? If somebody has some of their vertebrae fused, well, you're going to lose out on that contribution to that movement. You're going to lessen your overall range of motion when you have less little bits of contribution. The one, it's not even an exception, but in the cervical, if you guys remember from lab, you have that atlas axis, that specialized pivot joint. And what that is knowing that we can only work with the sum total of little bits. You have a specialized pivot joint that's like your radial ulna that gives you much more rotation. And so you still have contributions of your cervical, but the reason we want to get some extra transverse rotation is so that we can look all the way on one side and look all the way on the other for safety, danger, and not risk messing with our plumbing, because atlas axis doesn't mess with the plumbing, okay? All right. So let's talk verbiage. Again, rights and lefts, man, it gets people all the time. When we're talking about our pelvis or our spine, in terms of movements, right and left mean direction of movement. And we've had this before. The difference between right lateral, left lateral, right transverse, left transverse, that was a direction of spin. It was a direction of movement. Do a cartwheel to your right, do a cartwheel to your left is different than my right elbow and my left elbow. Okay? So for our spine, for our vertebra, we're going to have the easy ones. into fetal, out of fetal, contributing to flexion, contributing to extension. I'm going to get to the illusions later. But frontal and transverse follow a similar verbiage to the pelvic girdle rotations. Hey, trunk, bend in your frontal plane. The trunk's going to sway from side to side. Bend to your right, bend to your left. We call that right and left, lateral, side to side, right? Lateral trunk bending. Some books, some people might say trunk flexion. Synonymous, internal versus lateral. I mean, internal versus medial, external versus lateral, potato, potato. I prefer words like abduction to lateral flexion because I like to reserve flexion for sagittal. So lateral flexion to me loses the importance of what sagittal flexion is, and that's getting in the field. So a lot of clinicians and mechanists say, yeah, that's kind of, I see the conflict of interest between regular flexion, lateral flexion. So let's just say sway, side bending, lateral bending. Okay? So right lateral bending. Now remember, I have no problem with landmarks. My problem with landmarks is don't use global landmarks. Don't use the ceiling, the floor, the side, right? Don't use that. But it's 100% okay to use landmarks in the body so that you could see how things move relative to the articulating segments, okay? So for this, here are the main landmarks that I'm gonna teach you to use for trunk movement. And that is shoulders and pelvis. So in other words, when you're in anatomical position, your right is going to line up with your right, and your left is going to line up with your left. Okay? Sternum and pubis is going to be a major local landmark to be able to see when we rotate, to see differentiations, or when we flex, this is going to get closer to that, no different than this is going to get closer to that, okay? So there's going to be landmarks. Eventually, when we get to the cervical, the landmarks are going to be shoulders and ears. Right ear got closer to the right shoulder, left ear got closer to the left shoulder. Nose and sternum. So landmarks are okay if it's locally referenced, okay? So right and left, lateral, trunk bending. Well, Campbell, why do we call it trunk? Why don't we call it lumbar? It's a good question. Some people will call it lumbar. But remember earlier how I said your lumbar vertebra, they contribute the least amount of motion because they're the densest, they're the bottom. Okay? So when you're doing a crunch, most of that summative domino effect is from your thoracic. Those are the ones that move more than the lumbar. It's not that the lumbar didn't do something. So for the purposes of our class and other clinicians as well, basically we can differentiate cervical by itself, because I can move my neck without having to move any of these. But once you get into motion like this, it's the sum total of lumbar and thoracic. So lumbar and thoracic everything. You just say, hey, this that we get of our thorax is a sum total of contribution of lumbar and thoracic, and we're going to call that trunk. That makes sense? It's kind of short. Okay. So how can the trunk move? Sagittal, in the fetal, out of fetal, sternum to pubis, sagittal plane, trunk flexion, sternum away from pubis, sagittal plane extension. Okay, we're going to get into the illusions in our next part. These are just, it looks like it's moving and it is. Okay. Frontal plane. We go frontal plane. Right shoulder gets closer to right pelvis. Right lateral trunk bending. Left shoulder gets closer to the left side of the pelvis, left lateral, trunk bending. Right lateral, left lateral. Right lateral, left lateral. Okay. Here is my handle, here is my spout. So it'd be like this, and this, and this. Flexion would be this, and that. Okay. You could have flexion from, extension to. You could have extension from. Remember, hyper is just excessive. You could have right lateral from, left lateral to, left lateral from, right lateral to, right lateral from, left lateral to, left lateral from. Okay. Just like in the pelvis, right and left meant two different things in two different planes. You can do a cartwheel to your right, to your left, or you can spin to your right, to your left. Same thing for the trunk. My trunk can spin to its right or spin to its left. That's right transverse trunk rotation, left transverse trunk rotation. Here, the key is the clothing. The clues are in the clothing. So if I were to just rotate my pelvis, let's try to do it in the live stream first so that y'all have a reference to it, then I'll come back to it. If I was to just rotate my pelvis and not move my trunk, you wouldn't see my clothing twist very much. Because right and left stayed squared up with each other. Does that make sense? Left, left, right, right. Left, left, right, right. Now watch the difference when I just twist my trunk and I don't move my pelvis. Big difference. Left, whoa, where are you at? Oh, you're over here. Right, you're over here. They deviated in the transverse plane away from each other. They twisted, just like opening a bottle. Okay? If you can imagine your bottle of Powerade or water or coffee or whatever else, imagine it had a nose and you rotated it, that nose would no longer line up with where it started. So in this case, if my sternum was my nose and my pelvis is the bottle, cap bottle, if I twist this way, they no longer line up. Make sense? Okay. So for our trunk, flexion, extension, sagittal, right, left, lateral, frontal, right, left, transverse, transverse. All right, that's the easy part. Get ready for the fun part. The fun part is the concept that this is the pelvis and this is the trunk, an analogy, right? Pelvis and trunk. The fun part is if I tell you that left lateral is when the left shoulder gets closer to the left hip or the left pelvis, right? Relative local references. So left lateral could mean this is the front, just so that I can hold. Left lateral means this, got closer to this, true, but it also means this. This is the same local motion as this. What difference does it make if my slinky bends to bring my shoulder closer to my hip, or if my hip bends to come up and visit my shoulder? The bend, the curve is the exact same. Let's go sagittal plane. So I'm rotating, this is the front of my pelvis, just for this analogy, because I can grip the box. Trunk flexion would be the same as trunk flexion. You do these exercises sometimes when you're on the rolling chair, you get off the ground. Or let's look at it like this. You're laying down and you're doing crunches, trunk flexion, reverse crunch, trunk flexion. Crunch, trunk flexion, reverse crunch, trunk flexion. Okay. So for this one, again, right lateral is this gets closer to this, or this gets closer to that. Left lateral, this gets closer to this, or this gets closer to that. This is left lateral trunk. Right lateral trunk. You can start to see how there's going to be some practice that needs to go on, because right lateral pelvic girdle spin is going to cause left lateral trunk in this analogy. And that's okay. It should kind of make sense. If I know this doesn't bend like my trunk, but do we agree that this PVC pipe leans to the left? Good? My left. So if I take the chair and do right lateral rotation, put your left ear to your left shoulder. How's the pipe leaning? To the left. See it? Okay. We're going to get to those. I'm introducing you to the concepts. Transverse illusions. Sternum pubis. Hey, sternum, look to the left hip. No problem. Left transverse trunk rotation. Now I'm looking at my left hip. Hey, sternum, you stay still. And I'm going to rotate the pelvis so that you can look at the left hip. It's almost like, anybody ever been to Epcot at Disney World? I think I've been more times than I can remember. So, drinking around. I'm never going to travel the world, but I could go to F. The world can come to me in America. Horrible analogy. But what I'm trying to say is, when your trunk is moving and it looks like it's moving, like your sternum is going to visit the right, it's going to visit the left. But you can also move where the left comes to visit the sternum. Or the right side comes line up with the sternum. It doesn't have to be sternum moves to look to the right. It could be the right moves to come look at the sternum. But it still puts me in the same position. Right transverse trunk. Right transverse trunk. Let me do it less slow. This is the same as this. This is the same as this. Trunk, are you an anatomical? Nope. How would you rotate to go back if you could move yourself? I'd have to twist to the right to line myself back up. I mean, I had to twist to my left when I left. Twist to my left when I left. Lefts and rights, man. I'm telling you. So, transverse pelvic and transverse trunk don't have to line up. In fact, most of the time they won't. The only time they will is when you need to summate your circle, your functional circle of side of reach. So I give you an example. If I'm facing this way and I'm trying to reach back, one joint can't move all the way back here. I have to summate multiple joint motions. So right transverse pelvic, because of my hip joints, can reposition everything on top. And then right transverse trunk can help you reach back behind. Okay? However, if things are involving canceling out so that I can either stay working forward, looking forward, the pelvis and the trunk are going to have differentiating rotations. They're going to cancel each other out. Just like I did with the table. I'm sorry, with the chair. Chair does a cartwheel to the right, but if I don't want my trunk to move, the trunk has to bend back to the left. Let me give you a practical example of something you're familiar with. Okay? Won't move my trunk. Try not to. You shall not pass. All right, check this out. Right lateral pelvic girdle rotation because of left hip add and right hip add. Okay, big whoop. If my trunk stays in anatomical position, if my trunk stays straight, I'm literally the Leaning Tower of Pisa. What I don't want to do is, unless I'm trying to lift something off the ground, I definitely don't want to bend to the right. That's not going to get my eyes level and my shoulders level. So if I have right lateral pelvis, I probably want to bend my trunk back to the left to keep my shoulders level and my eyes level. Do you understand? If my pelvis rotates to the right, I want to bend my trunk back to the left to cancel out. So when people are shifting weight, you're standing in line and you shift weight from left to right, there's a lot of stuff happening there in that simple little shift. Your pelvis is tilted to the right laterally. You're going to have left lateral pelvic girdle rotation because of left hip add, right hip add, big whoop. Your trunk bent. It had to. Because if you're here and you stay in this trunk position, be here now. You're going to bend back to the right to keep your shoulders level and your eyes level. And if you stayed bending to the right and you shifted, back to the left. What's happening is it looks like this, and it's subtle, but it looks like this. Yoink. To keep the top part flat, your trunk has to bend the other way. So it's to teach you that the pelvis may be doing a right cartwheel, but your trunk is actually bending to its left. And the pelvis may be doing a left cartwheel, but your trunk is actually bending to its right. Get that? Questions so far? Let me see if I can pull up. Now, I'll do an analogy for you. It takes too much time to put the computer. Just don't laugh at not violent shaking when I try to hold positions in way. All right. Position is where you at, motion is where you want. Okay? So the question is, identify the position of the trunk. That's the question. Identify the position. I guess I got it over here. Did I tell you the story about why I go? So I was visiting my great aunt in the nursing home, and she was a Catholic, and she was really cool. She was blind, and so we go visit her, and I was watching TV with her, and this lady, I was maybe 12, 13 years old. And this lady wheeled her wheelchair up to watching Wheel of Fortune. And I looked at her and I said, "Hi, how are you doing, ma'am?" And and she looked at me and she was like, and she did this. And I was like, oh, and like I ran away because it freaked me out. And then, I mean, I was a kid, and then like I was like, I felt really bad because I was like, what if she was just like trying to say hello, or like I don't like this show, you know, like maybe she wanted to watch, you know, like The Price is Right or something. So I felt really, really bad. So I say that little sound in her memory. I'm thinking about you. I'm sorry. Probably. All right. You weren't expecting that story, huh? All right, you guys. Trunk position. One. My sternum is facing directly, or I'm trying to, at best, directly to the ceiling. I ain't holding this position for long. I can't hold this position for very long. Would anybody like a different view, or was that sufficient? Different view? You're just messing with me. Sternum's facing straight to the ceiling. Cool? Was I in a unique frontal position? Sagittal position or transverse position? What was the most obvious? Transverse, absolutely. The way I would look at it is, what hip was my sternum looking at? Absolutely. So therefore I had to twist it to my left. I was left transversely rotated. Does that make sense? Check out this little trick. If I can do it. You having a tough time see it? Wind up. Twist it to my left. The reason I started with a position question is because the motion question is going to mess with some of your heads. When I literally start here and do this, you're going to be like, ooh, right transverse pelvic. And I'm going to be like, ooh, you're right. What did the trunk do? And it's hard to see how the trunk had to twist back to the left. That's the only way you're going to have motion, is for them to do opposite spins. If my trunk and my pelvis didn't differentiate, and I was like, hey, pelvis, try to spin to your right. And if my pelvis spun to the right and my trunk spun to the right, I would literally like have to be over here. Does that make sense? They have to spin in opposition in that example. Here's another example of how they have to spin in opposition is in your seats. I actually like how your seats swivel. So for this experiment, note that some of you are going to have these support beams to the left side of it, and some are going to have it to the right side of it. So we can't all do the same thing. If the support beam is on the left side of your leg, hold on to the desk or grab onto the desk. Make sure your sternum stays lined up straight. Make sure your sternum keeps looking forward. If the support beam is to the left of your legs, undergo right transverse pelvic girdle rotation, but please try to keep your shoulders and your sternum facing forward. If the support beam is to the right of your legs, twist your pelvis to the left so that you have room. Try to keep that sternum looking forward. Try to keep those shoulders looking forward. You should be able to see how your trunk and your pelvis have to spin in opposition. So if the beam's on your left, you did right transverse pelvic, and you had left transverse trunk. If the beam is on your right, you're going to have left transverse pelvic and right transverse trunk. Cool. On unit 3, you're going to have to tell me, just like the hips are responsible for rotating the pelvis, when the hips are anchored, those muscles can spin the pelvis. When your feet are off the ground and your trunk is fixed, it's going to be the trunk that's responsible for rotating the pelvis. However, because again, it's all a progression, on unit 2, you're going to have to tell me how the trunk moved to maintain your functional position, to maintain your functional circle of reach or sight. What I mean by that is, if your pelvis says, hey, I'm going to go right lateral, your trunk wasn't responsible for spinning the pelvis, but you know what your trunk has to do? Bend back so that your shoulders and your eyes don't go to the side. That makes sense? It's like shocks on a car, where like things are happening on the bottom, but a bull rider, as the bull tries to take them forward, they lean back, and as the bull tries to take them back, they lean forward, right? You're trying to cancel these things out so that you can maintain with your eyes, your level of data processing, or with your shoulders, the ability to work, move, while things on the bottom might be. That's good, okay? So the motion isn't because of the trunk. The leveling of your shoulders and your eyes is going to be because of the trunk. Okay? Let's see if you can apply this concept. I'm going to give you some questions, okay? Oh, I know some of you hate this. Stand up. Come on. If you're willing and able. All right. So far we've done questions like anterior because of hip flexion, posterior because of hip flexion. You can also do anterior and posterior, but your whole upper body doesn't have to move, okay? So my question to you is, if you are standing and you undergo posterior pelvic girdle rotation, but you keep your shoulders level, start, finish. What's happening is that your pelvis is moving both from the trunk and your hips. Now, it's the hip musculature that's driving that spin. But if you have posterior, what motion did your trunk do to keep your shoulders level? You see how I'm asking it? What motion would your trunk have done if you were standing and you did posterior pelvic girdle rotation and your shoulders didn't sway or go anywhere? Your trunk had to do something. Because if it didn't, you'd be going back. If all you did was spin your pelvis about your hips and your trunk stayed in anatomical, you'd be, what's that dance? So what did your trunk do? Flexion. You had trunk flexion. Everybody see that? Okay. So the pelvic girdle rotation was posterior, the hip motion was hip extension, and the trunk motion was trunk flexion. Go the opposite, go anterior pelvic girdle rotation. You should feel your back like arcing. You feel that in your back. Anterior hip flexion, trunk extension. You feel that? Posterior hip extension. You should feel, when you do posterior spin, you should feel like your glutes tighten up. Okay? Because that's the hip extension pulling muscles making you extend. Trunk flexion, trunk extension. Okay? Now let's go lateral. Let's go side to side, okay? Stand on both feet and try to keep your trunk straight. Try. We're going to go left lateral pelvic girdle rotation. Let your trunk go with the flow. Start left lateral. Now I want you to be able to see, well, if I don't want my shoulders to move and I want to keep my shoulders level, wouldn't I have to bend back to the right? I have to bend back this way if I want to keep my shoulders level. So from here to there, it may not be obvious, but you had right lateral trunk bend. You had to, Because if you didn't, if your trunk stayed straight, you'd be the Leaning Tower of Pisa. You had to bend back to the right. Does that make sense? Okay? Let's do transverse. You do right transverse pelvic girdle rotation, both feet are on the ground, but try to keep your sternum facing forward. Do that. Can you go right transverse and keep your sternum facing forward? If you did, your trunk had to rotate. Because if it didn't rotate, if your trunk stayed at anatomical, you would have done this. So how did your trunk rotate? To its right or to its left? Left. Very good. You see it? Okay, have a seat. I know it's killing me.
I thought it was an interesting way to think of it.
What's an interesting way to think of?
So do the motion like very robotically, so like rotate everything to the right, and then you said put the trunk in the center, then you have to put the trunk to the left and put it in the center. Like that's an easy way to break it down.
Show me.
I'm trying to keep my trunk facing straight, but I need my hips to go that way.
Yeah.
Everything this way. Now I need my trunk to go back to the left.
Absolutely. That's what yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I thought if I didn't verbalize it, I thought I'd advertise it.
And I just broke it down as slower steps.
Break it down, man. Break it down. Slow is good. Slow is fast. So now let's mess with it. All right, you guys, let's do. See how much time we got? 4 minutes. Oh gosh. Any other? Maybe there's someone else who like sees it a little. I know that might be a lot, but is there anybody else who has a different way of kind of seeing the motions or seeing things? Any different perspectives out there? All perspectives are welcome because we're all different learners. Okay? All right. So before we keep going, there are some harder examples we're going to get to, but I want to make sure we understand. For your test, you're going to have to know it looks like it's moving, and it is. And you're going to have to see how the trunk is going to compensate as your hips rotate your pelvis. On unit 3, it's going to be how does the trunk actually spin the basketball when your feet are off the ground, like when you're in a Roman chair and you're doing these kind of things, okay? So I just wanted to differentiate that. Yes, sir?
So when you ask the question about the kind of hard question when it comes to moving up the trunk, is it going to be like obvious that the shoulders are like?
No, I'm going to try to make it as absolutely ambiguous as possible.
Okay.
No, of course. I mean, again, it's a great question, but I've said this so many times. I gotta give you enough. I can't have a blank page and just say what's happening. I have to give you enough information for you to differentiate obvious motion. I know it's tough, but I've been saying that several times. Like I gotta give you enough to be able to answer it. So don't stress about. Remember this. Remember I said I'm never going to ask you like what's that. It's the same for this. Like I can never give you something that's like. Cool. All right, guys. I'll try to work on my jokes, man. I know my jokes are lame. I'll work on it.
How are you again? Is always going to be opposite of
No, I gave you an example in class where if you were trying to reach back, then you could have right transverse pelvic and right transverse trunk. So that's going to be this like, instead of canceling, it's going to summate.
yes.
Because I can't get back there with just hips alone. And I can't get back there with just hips alone. So when you're trying to summate motion, so like with summation, I can literally look, right? But if I just move my neck alone, I'm only getting here.
Yeah,
But with this and this,
they're all different. Thank you.
you're welcome.
Over over the last exam we did on Wednesday, where you really went over